The Brazilian centre-back receives the ball just a few metres outside his own penalty area, lifts his head for a brief second, and immediately notices something that almost every football fan has seen hundreds of times without ever questioning it. The opposing striker slows down instead of accelerating, the midfield line hesitates before stepping forward, and the defenders behind them quietly retreat another few metres, creating the strange illusion that Brazil has somehow earned complete freedom before the match has even begun. While commentators describe it as patience and tactical discipline, even though what the world is actually witnessing is something much deeper. Nobody wants to be the first player to sprint toward the Brazilian defence, because for decades, that single decision has carried a frightening reputation, transforming ordinary pressing into one of the riskiest choices a football team can make against the most technically gifted nation the sport has ever produced. At first glance, it makes absolutely no sense. Every modern coach repeats exactly the same principle from the lowest youth academies to the biggest stadiums on earth. Press high, recover the ball early, never allow talented players enough time to think, force mistakes close to their own goal, and dictate the rhythm before the opponent can settle into the match. Against almost every elite team in the world, that philosophy has become one of football's greatest weapons, producing countless victories through relentless intensity and organised aggression. Yet the moment Brazil walks onto the pitch, those same coaches suddenly abandon ideas they have spent years perfecting, choosing instead to defend deeper, delay their pressure, and patiently wait behind the ball, as though attacking the Brazilian defence has become an unwritten rule nobody dares to break. To many supporters it looks like fear. To television analysts it often appears to be excessive respect. And to casual viewers it can even resemble tactical cowardice. But inside dressing rooms and coaching offices, the explanation sounds completely different. Long before kickoff, analysts study hours of footage searching for weaknesses. Assistant coaches build detailed reports describing every movement Brazil makes during possession, and tactical meetings frequently arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Pressing Brazil is not simply about running toward the ball. It is about surviving the first 3 seconds after you decide to do it, because those 3 seconds are precisely where Brazil has spent generations perfecting an art that almost nobody else has ever mastered. The myth surrounding Brazilian football was never created by spectacular goals alone. Every child who has ever fallen in love with the Seleção remembers impossible dribbles, outrageous pieces of skill, and unforgettable celebrations. But hidden beneath those iconic moments lies a football education unlike almost anywhere else on the planet. Long before future stars ever play inside massive stadiums, they spend thousands of hours solving impossible situations on tiny concrete courts, uneven streets, and crowded futsal arenas where space barely exists. Opponents arrive from every direction, and every extra touch invites disaster. Players raised inside that environment stop viewing pressure as danger. They begin seeing it as opportunity, because every defender rushing toward them automatically leaves another space somewhere else. That subtle difference changes everything. While most teams interpret an aggressive press as a signal to clear the ball, Brazil often interprets it as the beginning of an attack. Every sprint from an opposing striker creates another passing lane behind him. Every midfielder stepping forward opens another pocket of space between the lines, and every defender abandoning his position to close down a Brazilian attacker quietly creates a chain reaction spreading across the entire pitch. What appears to be defensive courage from one team frequently becomes offensive freedom for the other, which is why Brazil rarely looks surprised when opponents finally decide to attack high. In many cases, that is exactly the moment they have been waiting for. History is filled with unforgettable examples. Teams have arrived convinced that relentless pressure would suffocate Brazil before the game could settle, believing that intensity alone could disrupt the famous rhythm of Brazilian possession, only to discover within minutes that they were chasing shadows rather than footballers. The first line of pressure would be beaten by one clever turn, the second by a perfectly weighted one-touch pass, and suddenly the player who had started pressing only moments earlier found himself desperately sprinting back toward his own goal, while thousands of supporters gasped as another Brazilian counterattack unfolded with breathtaking speed. Those sequences rarely lasted more than 10 seconds, yet they were powerful enough to reshape entire tactical philosophies. Coaches around the world eventually began recognizing a fascinating pattern. The teams that enjoyed the greatest success against Brazil were not necessarily the fastest, strongest, or even the most talented. They were the teams disciplined enough to resist temptation. Instead of chasing every pass, they waited. Instead of pressing every defender, they observed. Instead of attacking the ball emotionally, they attacked space methodically, understanding that Brazil often wanted opponents to become impatient because impatience naturally destroys defensive structure. The greatest trap was never the dribble itself. The trap was convincing an opponent that pressing harder would eventually solve the problem, when in reality, every additional step forward only strengthened Brazil's greatest weapon. Yet this raises an even more fascinating question. If the entire football world understands how dangerous it can be to press Brazil, why do a handful of teams occasionally succeed where so many others have failed? Why have certain coaches discovered moments when the impossible suddenly becomes possible, exposing weaknesses hidden beneath decades of brilliance without abandoning their own identity in the process? The answer has almost nothing to do with running faster or defending deeper. It begins with understanding one uncomfortable truth that Brazilian football has quietly forced the rest of the world to accept for generations. Brazil never taught football to fear pressure. Brazil taught football to fear pressing at the wrong moment. And that single distinction changed modern football far more than most people ever realized. To understand why pressing Brazil feels so dangerous, you first have to forget almost everything modern football teaches about defending. Coaches spend years building pressing systems based on one simple belief: reduce time, reduce space, and eventually even the greatest players will make mistakes. Against most national teams, that philosophy works remarkably well, because pressure naturally forces rushed decisions, inaccurate passes, and broken attacking patterns. But Brazil has spent decades developing players inside environments where time and space almost never exist, creating footballers whose first instinct under pressure is not survival, but creativity. While most players panic when surrounded by three opponents, Brazilian players often become calmer because they have already experienced far more chaotic situations thousands of times before reaching the professional level. That education begins long before tactical diagrams or elite academies enter the picture. Across countless neighborhoods, children grow up playing futsal on compact courts, where every mistake is punished instantly, where defenders arrive within fractions of a second, where walls replace touchlines, and where there is barely enough room to complete 2 passes before someone attempts a tackle. The ball moves faster than the players themselves, decisions must be made almost instinctively, and technical perfection slowly becomes less of a luxury and more of a necessity for survival. After years inside that environment, receiving the ball with an opponent charging toward you no longer feels uncomfortable, it feels familiar. By the time many Brazilian players reach the international stage, the enormous spaces found on a full-sized football pitch almost seem generous compared to the conditions that shape them. This is precisely where so many opponents unknowingly make their biggest mistake. They believe pressure is something Brazil wants to avoid, when in reality, pressure often provides the exact conditions Brazilian football is designed to exploit. Every aggressive sprint toward the ball compresses one area of the pitch, while simultaneously expanding another. Every defender stepping forward leaves someone else responsible for covering the space behind him, and every midfielder abandoning his position creates a new passing lane that did not exist only seconds earlier. Brazil's greatest playmakers rarely defeat pressure through individual magic alone. They defeat it because the movement of the pressing team quietly creates solutions before the ball has even been touched. Watch the sequence carefully, and the pattern becomes almost hypnotic. A centre-back receives possession near his own penalty area, while an opposing striker immediately accelerates toward him, convinced he has forced the defender into a difficult situation. The Brazilian defender calmly delays his pass for 1 extra second, almost inviting the challenge to continue, before releasing the ball into midfield at the exact moment another opponent commits himself forward. Suddenly, the midfielder receiving possession turns into open space. One teammate drifts between the defensive lines, another overlaps on the outside, and within 3 effortless passes, the entire press has disappeared behind the play. What looked like defensive aggression only moments earlier has quietly transformed into numerical superiority for Brazil, leaving the chasing team desperately trying to recover the shape it willingly abandoned. None of this happens by accident. Brazilian players rarely occupy static positions because their football culture encourages constant rotation rather than rigid structure. Fullbacks appear in midfield, midfielders drift wide, wingers suddenly occupy central areas, and forwards willingly drop deep to create overloads, making it almost impossible for opponents to decide who should press and who should hold position. The moment one defender follows his assigned opponent too aggressively, another Brazilian player quietly moves into the newly created space, beginning a chain reaction that spreads across the pitch with astonishing speed. To spectators, it often looks spontaneous, almost improvised, but beneath that apparent freedom lies years of shared football education, where movement without the ball becomes every bit as important as the player controlling it. Psychology only makes the problem worse. Imagine chasing Brazil successfully for 15 or 20 minutes, covering enormous distances while executing every pressing trigger exactly as planned, only to watch one perfectly timed combination erase the work of your entire team within seconds. That single sequence plants doubt inside every player's mind. The next time Brazil builds from the back, half a second of hesitation appears. One midfielder decides not to step forward quite as aggressively. A fullback delays his run just long enough to remain cautious. Those tiny moments of uncertainty rarely attract attention from television cameras, yet they gradually weaken the entire pressing structure until it no longer functions as one coordinated unit. Brazil doesn't simply beat the press technically. They slowly convince opponents to stop believing in it emotionally. This psychological battle explains why some of the world's best pressing teams have looked strangely passive against Brazil, despite dominating similar opponents only days earlier. Coaches understand that successful pressing demands absolute collective commitment. If even one player hesitates, the entire structure collapses. Against Brazil, hesitation spreads more quickly than confidence, because every failed attempt reinforces memories of previous teams that suffered exactly the same fate. Footballers begin asking themselves dangerous questions while the match is still unfolding. Should I step forward? Should I stay deeper? Should I follow the runner? Should I protect the space instead? Those questions consume precious fractions of a second, and against Brazil, fractions of a second are often enough to change everything. For decades, the rest of the football world searched for stronger defenders, faster midfielders, and more aggressive pressing systems capable of solving the Brazilian puzzle. Yet the answer was never hidden inside physical superiority alone. It required something much more difficult. It required knowing exactly when not to press, when to remain patient, and most importantly, when to resist the irresistible temptation of chasing a ball that Brazil desperately wanted you to chase. The teams that finally began challenging the Seleção consistently understood one simple truth that many of their predecessors ignored. You cannot defeat Brazil by pressing every pass. You defeat Brazil by choosing the one pass that deserves to be pressed. And discovering that difference would eventually transform the tactical thinking of the entire football world. For years, football fans believed the mystery surrounding Brazil could be explained by extraordinary technique, breathtaking dribbling, or the endless production of world-class talent. But the deeper truth was always far more fascinating. Brazil never forced opponents to respect them through reputation alone. They built a football culture capable of manipulating the emotions of the team standing across from them, creating an environment where every decision became more difficult than it appeared. Every pressing trigger carried hidden risks, and every successful defensive action demanded almost perfect synchronization. Long before the first goal was scored, the psychological battle had already begun, because the greatest Brazilian teams understood that uncertainty spreads through a defense much faster than fear ever could. Eventually, however, football began to evolve. Coaches across Europe started asking different questions, abandoning the impossible dream of pressing Brazil continuously, and instead searching for specific moments when the famous rhythm briefly disappeared. They discovered that every possession is not equally dangerous, every defender is not equally comfortable under pressure, and every passing sequence contains tiny moments of imbalance, invisible to most spectators. Instead of attacking Brazil emotionally, they began attacking mathematically, carefully identifying the exact player, the exact angle, and the exact second where the risk of pressing became smaller than the reward. It was no longer about courage, it became about precision. One of the greatest misunderstandings in modern football is the belief that elite pressing means running more than the opponent. In reality, the best pressing teams often run less because every movement has a clear purpose. Against Brazil, this principle became even more important. Rather than chasing every pass, successful teams waited patiently for predetermined triggers. A defender receiving the ball on his weaker foot, a slightly underhit pass across the back line, a midfielder forced to receive while facing his own goal, or a goalkeeper taking one touch too many. Those moments lasted barely a second, yet they represented the only windows where Brazil briefly lost the natural harmony that made their possession almost impossible to disrupt. Miss that window, and the opportunity disappeared. Attack too early, and Brazil punished you. Attack too late, and the ball was already somewhere else. This transformation marked one of the biggest tactical revolutions of the modern era. Coaches no longer prepared for Brazil by drawing arrows everywhere across the tactical board or demanding relentless aggression from the opening whistle. Instead, they built entire game plans around patience, synchronization, and emotional control, teaching players that discipline was often more valuable than intensity. Defenders learned to ignore the temptation of stepping out of position simply because the ball looked vulnerable. Midfielders practiced delaying pressure by fractions of a second until teammates arrived in support, and forwards accepted that the most intelligent pressing run was sometimes the one they deliberately chose not to make. Football slowly shifted away from chaos and toward calculated precision, largely because Brazil had forced the sport to evolve. Ironically, Brazil themselves contributed to that evolution. Every generation produced new footballers capable of solving increasingly complex tactical problems, pushing opponents to invent even more sophisticated defensive systems in response. What began decades earlier as spontaneous street football gradually transformed into an endless tactical arms race, where creativity challenged organization and organization responded with even greater intelligence. Each World Cup, every Copa America, and countless international friendlies became laboratories where the world's greatest coaches tested new ideas against the one national team that had always represented football's highest technical standard. Brazil didn't just shape attacking football, they shaped the way the entire world learned to defend. Yet despite all those innovations, one remarkable fact remains unchanged. Even today, whenever Brazil calmly begins building possession from the back, an almost instinctive hesitation still appears inside many opponents. It lasts only a heartbeat. One forward wonders whether to sprint. One midfielder glances sideways before committing. One defender chooses to wait just a fraction longer than planned. Those tiny pauses rarely appear in post-match statistics, yet they reveal how deeply Brazil's influence has been embedded into modern football. Decades of unforgettable moments have taught elite players that pressing Brazil is never simply about winning the ball. It is about surviving everything that happens after you fail. Perhaps that is why the Seleção has remained so unique throughout football history. Great teams are remembered because they score beautiful goals, dominate tournaments or lift famous trophies, but truly legendary teams leave behind something much larger than medals. They change the way future generations think about the game itself. Brazil taught the football world that pressure could be transformed into opportunity, that chaos could become structure, and that the fastest way forward was sometimes allowing opponents to believe they were in complete control. Very few national teams have ever altered football's tactical language in such a profound way. So the next time Brazil begins another attack, and you notice an opposing striker slowing down instead of charging forward, don't mistake that hesitation for fear or a lack of ambition. What you are witnessing is the invisible legacy of decades spent forcing the greatest teams on earth to rethink one of football's oldest ideas. Somewhere inside that single cautious step lives the memory of countless defenders who pressed too early, countless coaches whose plans collapsed within seconds, and countless matches where one aggressive decision became the beginning of disaster. Because the greatest secret of Brazilian football was never that nobody could press them. It was that Brazil convinced the football world to question when pressing was truly worth the risk. And in a sport decided by moments, That single question changed football forever.